Welcome to Defense Insight Brief. Tonight at the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide choke point through which 40% of the world's seaborne oil supply flows and through which the United States Navy has projected the military power, underwriting American global dominance for 8 decades at 1:24 a.m., 2,500 Fattah-4 hypersonic missiles departed their road-mobile launchers across the full coastal arc of southwestern Iran in a coordinated launch sequence spanning less than 4 minutes that produced a threat signature so vast, so geometrically precise, and so unambiguously lethal that the automated defense systems of 5 American carrier strike groups triggered their highest priority alert protocols simultaneously before a single human operator aboard any of those vessels had processed what their instruments were collectively and correctly. Reporting. 5 carrier strike groups: the USS Gerald Ford, the USS Nimitz, the USS Harry Truman, the USS Dwight Eisenhower, the USS Abraham Lincoln, the most concentrated assembly of American naval firepower since the Second World War, positioned at the Strait of Hormuz as the ultimate demonstration of American resolve and American reach, the living embodiment of the strategic principle that American naval supremacy cannot be challenged, cannot be defeated, and cannot be driven from the waters it chooses to occupy. Together, these 5 carriers and their accompanying strike group vessels represented over $500 billion of American naval investment, 15 combat air wings of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, 25,000 American sailors and aviators whose presence at Hormuz was intended to communicate a single unambiguous message to Tehran: that the consequences of Iranian aggression would be immediate, overwhelming, and decisive. At 1:24 a.m., Iran sent its reply. 2,500 Fattah-4 hypersonic missiles traveling at speeds approaching Mach 20 in their terminal phase weapons, whose existence Western intelligence had assessed as at least 3 years from operational deployment as recently as 6 months ago, converged on the 5 carrier strike groups from multiple vectors simultaneously in an engagement that lasted exactly 20 minutes and 2 seconds from first impact to final detonation. When it was over, 5 American aircraft carriers had been destroyed. The most powerful naval force ever assembled in the waters of the Persian Gulf had ceased to exist as a functioning military formation. And in Washington, where the damage assessments were arriving at a situation room that had no established protocol for processing the simultaneous loss of 5 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the word defining every conversation, every corridor, and every face in every room where American national security decisions are made, was the word in tonight's title: chaos. This is Defense Insight Brief. Stay with us. Full questions will drive everything in tonight's analysis. How did Iran develop the Fattah-4 hypersonic platform and deploy 2,500 of them against 5 carrier strike groups simultaneously? And what does the operational execution of the Hormuz strike reveal about the depth of Iranian anti-access and area denial capability that Western naval planning had catastrophically underestimated? What specific attack sequence did Iran use to defeat the layered defensive architecture of 5 simultaneous carrier strike groups? And why did the most expensive and most sophisticated naval defense systems ever deployed fail so completely? And so, finally, against what Iran launched at 1:24 a.m., what is the specific nature of the chaos consuming Washington? And what does the simultaneous loss of 5 carriers mean for American naval power, American global reach, and the credibility of American military commitment to allies in every theater worldwide? And what does the destruction of 5 American carriers at the Strait of Hormuz mean for the petrodollar, the global oil order, and the accelerating transition to a multipolar world in which American naval supremacy is no longer the organizing principle of international security? Every answer is coming. Stay with us. Defense Insight Brief delivers the strategic depth and the operational honesty that this moment demands, and that every institutional voice is structured to withhold. If this channel is giving you what you cannot find anywhere else, demonstrate it right now. Hit like, subscribe immediately, share this video across every platform you use, and leave your strategic assessment in the comments below. We engage with everything our community produces. Now let us get into the full operational picture of what happened at the Strait of Hormuz at 1:24 a.m. To understand what happened at the Strait of Hormuz in 20 minutes and 2 seconds, we need to understand the operational architecture of the strike with the same precision that Iranian military planners applied in designing it, because the destruction of 5 American carrier strike groups was not the product of overwhelming numerical force alone. Though 2,500 hypersonic missiles is a number that by itself exceeds the combined interceptor capacity of every defensive platform assembled in the Strait. It was a product of a strike architecture whose sequencing, timing, and targeting logic was specifically engineered to defeat the specific defensive capabilities of 5 carrier strike groups operating in coordinated mutual support, exploiting vulnerabilities in American naval defensive doctrine that the planners in Tehran had studied, mapped, and prepared to exploit for years before the first Fattah-4 left its launcher. The 5 carrier strike groups at Hormuz were arrayed in a defensive formation specifically designed to maximize mutual support and overlapping defensive coverage. The Gerald Ford and its strike group occupied the northern position closest to the Iranian coastline and therefore the primary defensive barrier for the formation as a whole. The Nimitz and the Harry Truman were positioned in the central corridor, their Aegis cruisers and destroyers providing the deepest magazine depth of any vessels in the formation. The Eisenhower and the Abraham Lincoln occupied the southern positions, their strike groups oriented to provide defensive coverage of the formation's most vulnerable flanks and to serve as the last line of defensive interception if threats penetrated the northern and central layers. Iranian strike planners had studied this formation through continuous intelligence collection against American carrier strike group positioning and defensive doctrine for years. They understood not just the positions of the individual vessels, but the specific defensive coverage zones each provided, the electromagnetic signatures of each ship's radar systems, the interceptor magazine depths of each Aegis platform, and the specific coordination protocols through which the 5 strike groups would manage a joint defensive engagement. That understanding was the foundation on which the Hormuz strike's 4-phase attack architecture was built. The first phase of the Hormuz strike was not a missile attack. It was an electronic warfare operation of extraordinary sophistication that preceded the first Fattah-4 launch by 40 seconds and was designed to accomplish a single critical objective: degrading the radar picture available to the 5 carrier strike groups' Aegis combat systems from the high-confidence threat tracking that enables reliable interception to the degraded confidence tracking that produces the reduced kill probabilities that make saturation attacks decisive rather than merely costly. At 1:24 a.m., precisely Iranian electronic warfare assets that had been prepositioning in the operational area for 72 hours embedded within the electronic signatures of commercial maritime traffic transiting the Strait simultaneously activated a coordinated burst of jamming and spoofing across the full frequency range used by the Spy-6 and Spy-1 radar arrays of every Aegis platform in the 5 strike groups. The jamming package was not designed to completely blind these systems, which are hardened against electronic warfare to an extraordinary degree. It was designed to do something more specific and more strategically consequential: to reduce the tracking confidence of the Aegis fire control systems against fast-moving hypersonic targets from the near-certainty engagement solutions required for reliable single-shot interceptions to the degraded confidence solutions that require multiple interceptors per target to maintain acceptable kill probabilities, thereby dramatically accelerating the rate at which each platform's interceptor magazine would be exhausted against the incoming wave. Simultaneously, the electronic warfare package executed a targeted spoofing operation against the intership data links, connecting the 5 strike groups' Aegis systems into a coordinated battle management network. The spoofing generated false track data that mimicked the signatures of incoming ballistic missile threats from directions other than the actual Fattah-4 approach vectors, forcing the battle management network to allocate defensive resources against phantom threats before the real attack arrived. The 40 seconds between the electronic warfare activation and the first Fattah-4 launch was precisely calculated to allow the spoofed phantom tracks to propagate fully through the battle management network and generate interceptor allocation decisions before the genuine hypersonic threats appeared on the degraded radar picture. 40 seconds after the electronic warfare package activated at 1:24 a.m., and 40 seconds the first wave of 800 Fattah-4 missiles entered the engagement envelope of the 5 carrier strike groups' outer defensive perimeter. These 800 missiles were not aimed at the carriers themselves. They were aimed at the Aegis cruisers and destroyers, forming the outer defensive screen of each strike group. Specifically, the platforms carrying the largest SM-6 and SM-3 interceptor magazines, whose depletion was the operational prerequisite for the carrier kills that would follow. The Fattah-4's terminal velocity of Mach 20, combined with its maneuvering re-entry vehicle, executing continuous lateral displacements of up to 60 meters per second in its terminal phase, pushed the kill probability SM-6 interceptors engaging it in single-shot engagements to approximately 15% under optimal radar tracking conditions. Against the degraded radar picture produced by the electronic warfare package, that kill probability fell to below 10%. To achieve a 90% probability of destroying a single Fattah-4, an Aegis platform needed to fire between 7 and 10 SM-6 interceptors in a salvo. Against 800 simultaneous incoming missiles arriving from multiple vectors, the mathematics of magazine exhaustion were resolved before the engagement had run for 3 minutes. The 5 carrier strike groups collectively entered the engagement with an estimated combined interceptor inventory of approximately 2,400 SM-6 and SM-3 missiles across all platforms. Against 800 Fattah-4 missiles, each requiring 7 to 10 interceptors for reliable defeat in the degraded tracking environment. The theoretical interceptor requirement for the first wave alone was between 5,600 and 8,000 rounds, more than twice the available inventory. The first wave was designed to exhaust the outer defensive screen's magazine depth completely, while accepting that a significant fraction of its missiles would be intercepted, because the strategic purpose of the first wave was not primarily destructive, it was consumptive. It was designed to drain the magazines that would otherwise have defended against the waves that followed. In the 7 minutes from 1:24 a.m. and 40 seconds to 1:31 a.m., the outer defensive screen of all 5 carrier strike groups fired continuously. Approximately 2,200 interceptors were expended against the first wave. 640 of the 800 first wave Fattah-4 missiles were destroyed. 160 impacted across the outer screen vessels, destroying 9 Aegis destroyers and severely damaging 4 cruisers. More critically, the interceptor magazines of every surviving outer screen vessel had been reduced to critically low levels. The magazines that stood between the carriers and the second wave were effectively empty. The second wave of 1,000 Fattah-4 missiles arrived at 1:31 a.m., 7 minutes after the first wave's opening. Impacts defined a defensive environment that bore no resemblance to the one that had been, designed to protect the 5 carriers. The outer screen vessels that had provided the deepest defensive magazine depth were destroyed or magazine exhausted. The inner screen vessels, the cruisers and destroyers, positioned closer to each carrier, had expended a significant fraction of their own interceptor inventories supporting the outer screen engagement, and were now attempting to defend against 1,000 hypersonic missiles, with resources measured in dozens of interceptors rather than hundreds. The second wave was structured in 5 simultaneous sub-packages of 200 missiles, each one directed at each carrier strike group, timed to arrive at each group's inner defensive perimeter simultaneously. The coordination required to achieve this simultaneous arrival across 5 geographically separated strike groups, each approached from a slightly different vector, required a precision of launch sequencing and flight time management that represents the most demanding operational coordination achievement of the entire Hormuz strike. Against 1,000 Fattah-4 missiles arriving simultaneously at 5 positions across the strait, with inner screen platforms averaging fewer than 40 interceptors remaining per vessel, the defensive response was a fraction of what had met the first wave. The 5 carrier strike groups fired everything they had, combined with the point defense systems of the carriers themselves, the CRAM and CIVS installations that represent the last line of close-in defense for a carrier under attack. The American defensive response to the second wave achieved intercept rates of approximately 12%. 88% of the second wave's missiles reached their designated targets. The USS Gerald Ford was struck by 47 Fattah-4 warheads in the space of 90 seconds beginning at 1:33 a.m. The first impacts destroyed the flight deck and the island superstructure. The second impacts penetrated to the hangar deck level, igniting aviation fuel and generating secondary explosions that propagated through the ship's interior with devastating speed. The nuclear reactor compartments entered emergency shutdown as automated protection systems responded to the structural damage cascading through the hull. By 1:35 a.m., the Gerald Ford was listing at 22 degrees, and its surviving crew had received the abandon ship order. The USS Nimitz was struck by 39 Fattah-4 warheads between 1:34 a.m. and 1:36 a.m. The strike pattern against the Nimitz was concentrated on the vessel's engineering spaces and propulsion systems, reflecting targeting intelligence that had identified the Nimitz power plant configuration as a specific vulnerability. The simultaneous destruction of multiple propulsion system components eliminated the vessel's ability to maneuver, leaving it stationary and helpless against the follow-on impacts that completed its structural destruction. The Nimitz sank at 1:49 a.m. The USS Harry Truman, USS Dwight Eisenhower, and USS Abraham Lincoln were struck in the same 7-minute window between 1:34 a.m. and 1:41 a.m., each receiving between 31 and 44 warhead impacts that produced the same progression of flight deck destruction, internal fires, reactor shutdown, and progressive structural failure that had eliminated the Gerald Ford and Nimitz. By 1:41 a.m., all 5 carriers had received fatal damage. The abandoned ship order had been issued from every vessel, and the most powerful naval formation in American history had been destroyed. The third and final wave of 700 Fattah-4 missiles arrived at 1:41 a.m. to complete the destruction of any surviving surface combatants that the first 2 waves had not eliminated, and to ensure the comprehensive destruction of every vessel in all 5 carrier strike groups that retained any residual military capability. Against defensive systems that had been completely exhausted by the preceding engagement, the third wave encountered essentially no meaningful resistance. The 700 missiles of the third wave impacted across the surviving vessels of the 5 strike groups over 3 minutes of final destruction that left no surface combatant in any of the 5 formations in a condition capable of independent operation. At 1:44 a.m. and 2 seconds, the last Fattah-4 of the third wave impacted the stern section of a severely damaged Arleigh Burke destroyer that had been attempting to provide close-in defense for the stricken Abraham Lincoln. 20 minutes and 2 seconds after the first electronic warfare activation, at 1:24 a.m., 5 American aircraft carriers and the majority of their escorting surface combatants had been destroyed at the Strait of Hormuz. The Fattah-4 represents the most significant discontinuity in the history of Iranian hypersonic weapons development and the most consequential single-weapon system development achievement by any non-nuclear state in the post-Cold War era. To understand why, it is necessary to understand what distinguishes the Fattah-4 from the earlier Fattah series platforms that have been deployed throughout this conflict and from every other hypersonic weapons system currently in operational service anywhere in the world. The Fattah-3, the previous apex of Iranian hypersonic development, achieves terminal velocities between Mach 13 and Mach 15 through a boost glide trajectory that provides significant range and maneuverability at the cost of the predictability that higher energy boost phases produce. The Fattah-4 uses a fundamentally different propulsion architecture, a combined cycle engine that maintains powered hypersonic flight through the terminal phase rather than transitioning to unpowered glide, achieving sustained terminal velocities approaching Mach 20 while simultaneously maintaining the lateral maneuvering capability of a glide vehicle. This powered terminal phase is the critical technical advance that makes the Fattah-4 qualitatively different from every predecessor system. At Mach 20, the Fattah-4 covers approximately 7 kilometers per second in its terminal approach. Against a carrier strike group whose outer defensive perimeter extends to approximately 500 kilometers, the weapon's terminal phase provides a reaction window of less than 72 seconds from the moment of first radar detection to impact, assuming radar detection occurs at the outer perimeter boundary. Against the degraded radar picture produced by Iran's electronic warfare package, detection ranges are significantly reduced and reaction windows proportionally compressed in several documented engagements during the Hormuz strike, approaching 30 seconds or less. The warhead carried by the Fattah-4 in its anti-ship configuration weighs approximately 800 kilograms and uses a shaped charge penetrator specifically designed to defeat the armored flight deck and hull construction of Nimitz and Ford-class carriers. The penetrating nose section drives through the flight deck and hangar deck layers before the main charge detonates, maximizing internal structural damage rather than producing a surface explosion whose effects are partly absorbed by the ship's external structure. against a carrier receiving multiple simultaneous impacts from Fattah-4 warheads. In this configuration, the cumulative internal structural damage is catastrophic and essentially irreversible within the 20-minute engagement window. The production of 2,500 Fattah-4 missiles in operational condition confirms that Iranian hypersonic industrial capacity has achieved output rates across its most advanced system that no Western assessment had projected as achievable. The Fattah-4 is not a prototype or a small batch prestige weapon. It is a production system generated in quantities sufficient to simultaneously engage 5 carrier strike groups with margins sufficient to absorb the interception performance of the most capable naval defensive systems in the world and quote-unquote still achieve the devastating results demonstrated at Hormuz. The chaos consuming Washington in the aftermath of the Hormuz strike is of a character that no previous American military disaster has produced, because no previous American military disaster has produced consequences of this magnitude in this time frame. The simultaneous loss of 5 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, 25,000 sailors and aviators, 15 combat air wings, and the complete destruction of the most powerful naval formation in history in 20 minutes at a location that American naval strategy had treated as the ultimate demonstration of American military invulnerability has shattered every institutional framework through which American military power has been assessed, communicated, and operationalized since the Second World War. The financial markets opened 2 hours after the Hormuz strike was confirmed and produced the largest single-day market movement in recorded financial history. The dollar index fell by a margin that analysts described as technically impossible under normal market functioning before circuit breakers halted trading. Oil prices spiked above $250 per barrel before the same circuit breakers interrupted commodity trading. The Treasury market experienced bid-ask spreads that reflected a complete collapse of market-making confidence in dollar-denominated instruments. The petrodollar system, already under severe structural stress from the preceding weeks of this conflict, received a shock at Hormuz that its remaining institutional foundations cannot absorb. Inside the National Security Council, the chaos has produced a decision-making paralysis of historic proportions. Every military response option requires naval assets that have just been destroyed forward, basing access that has been progressively compromised, and air power concentration at locations that have been demonstrated to be vulnerable to Iranian hypersonic saturation attack. The option of doing nothing carries political costs that no American administration can survive. The option of escalating with the assets remaining available carries military risks that no American commander can honestly assess as manageable. Washington is caught between a political imperative and a military reality that are irreconcilable with each other and with any strategic outcome that deserves the name. The international response has produced diplomatic movements of historic significance across every region of the global system. Every American ally in every geographic theater is conducting immediate and explicit reassessment of the security arrangements they have built around the assumption of American naval supremacy. Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese officials are in emergency consultations about strategic alternatives. European NATO members are conducting the most fundamental review of their security architecture since the alliance's founding. And the nations of the Global South that have maintained careful neutrality are now making the explicit strategic alignment choices that the events of this conflict have been building toward since its first days. The decision to simultaneously engage 5 American carrier strike groups with 2,500 hypersonic missiles at the Strait of Hormuz was the single most audacious operational decision in the history of Iranian military planning and one of the most consequential in the history of warfare since the nuclear age began. It was made with full awareness that the destruction of 5 American carriers would cross a threshold of American domestic and international response that no previous Iranian military action had approached. It was made with the understanding that the consequences would represent the most severe test of Iranian national resilience in the nation's modern history, and it was made anyway, reflecting a strategic confidence built on the accumulated operational evidence of this conflict that the window of American vulnerability had opened sufficiently wide to make success not just possible, but operationally achievable within the 20-minute engagement window the Fattah-4's performance parameters provided. Iran's willingness to execute this strike reflects something deeper than tactical calculation. It reflects the strategic consciousness of a nation that has spent 4 decades studying the specific vulnerabilities of American naval power in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf and developing the specific capabilities required to exploit those vulnerabilities at the moment of maximum strategic effect. The Hormuz strike is not the product of improvised wartime planning. It is the operational expression of a strategic theory developed and refined across decades of patient preparation, validated tonight by 20 minutes of hypersonic fire that has permanently altered the global naval balance. The destruction of 5 American aircraft carriers at the Strait of Hormuz has produced a global strategic shock of a magnitude that no previous event in the post-World War II era has generated. American naval supremacy, the foundational military reality underwriting the global order since 1945, has been operationally and definitively challenged at the world's most strategically critical maritime choke point and found to be defeatable by conventional hypersonic weapons deployed in sufficient numbers with sufficient precision and sophistication. The Strait of Hormuz is now closed to American naval vessels, not through diplomatic declaration but through the demonstrated operational reality that American surface combatants cannot survive in waters where Iranian Fattah-4 missiles can reach them. The 40% of global seaborne oil supply that transits the strait is now flowing or not flowing according to Iranian decision, not American policy. The petrodollar system has lost the naval enforcement mechanism that gave its rules their practical authority. The transition from a dollar-anchored to a multipolar global financial system has been accelerated by an order of magnitude in 20 minutes. Russia, China, and the broader four-power axis are the structural beneficiaries of everything that has happened at Hormuz. Moscow's energy revenues are climbing toward levels that make the Western sanctions regime irrelevant. Beijing's alternative financial architecture is absorbing the global system's transition away from dollar dependence at rates, reflecting genuine strategic urgency. And the multipolar world order, whose construction has been the strategic objective of the Russia-China axis for over a decade, is now being formally institutionalized through the decisions of governments that have concluded, based on the operational evidence of the Hormuz strike, that American naval supremacy is no longer the organizing principle of the international system. We close tonight at a moment whose strategic gravity demands a clarity and a directness that the magnitude of what has happened at the Strait of Hormuz both requires and deserves. 5 American aircraft carriers have been destroyed in 20 minutes and 2 seconds by 2,500 Iranian Fattah-4 hypersonic missiles. That sentence needs to be held without the protective distance of strategic framing before any honest analysis of its implications can begin. 5 vessels, each one over 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered steel, each one carrying thousands of American sailors and aviators who went to sea trusting that the institution they served had prepared them adequately for the threats they would face. That trust was broken at 1:24 a.m. at the Strait of Hormuz, and the institutional failure that broke it was not made on the morning of the strike. It was made across years of comfortable assessment and systematic complacency that consistently substituted optimistic projection for honest engagement with the observable evidence of Iranian hypersonic development. The price of that failure has been paid tonight in the waters of the Persian Gulf by people who had no voice in the decisions that produced it. Consider what has been lost in 20 minutes and 2 seconds beyond the steel and the lives. American naval supremacy, the foundational military reality underwriting the global order since 1945, has been operationally defeated at the world's most strategically critical maritime choke point. The Carrier Strike Group, the primary instrument through which American military power has been projected and made credible for 8 decades, has been shown to be defeatable by conventional hypersonic weapons deployed in sufficient numbers with sufficient precision. That demonstration cannot be undone by any recovery effort, any diplomatic initiative, or any communication strategy. It exists as an operational fact, confirmed by the wreckage of 5 nuclear-powered carriers on the floor of the Persian Gulf, visible to every satellite and every intelligence service on Earth, and impossible to credibly characterize as anything other than what it is. Washington's chaos is the rational response of an institution that has just lost the foundational instrument of its global influence in less than half an hour. Every response option available carries costs that no rational strategic calculus can accept as preferable to the current situation. Escalation requires naval assets that are wreckage. Conventional air campaigns require forward basing that Iranian anti-access capabilities have made untenable. Diplomatic engagement requires a posture of strength that the Hormuz strike has visibly eliminated. And absorbing the loss of 5 carriers without a response that changes the strategic dynamic is a political impossibility for any administration, regardless of how clearly strategic logic demands exactly that restraint. Washington is caught between a political imperative and a military reality that are irreconcilable, and the chaos that irreconcilability produces is what every corridor of the American national security establishment is experiencing tonight. The petrodollar has received at Hormuz the blow that the preceding weeks of this conflict had been building toward. The 40% of global seaborne oil supply that transits the strait now flows according to Iranian decision rather than American policy. The naval enforcement mechanism that gave dollar-denominated energy pricing its practical authority has been destroyed in 20 minutes. The transition from a dollar-anchored to a multipolar global financial system has been accelerated by an order of magnitude. The financial market movements following the strike's confirmation are not panic reactions that will normalize as the immediate shock fades. They are the first institutional expressions of a permanent structural reassessment of dollar dominance that will continue compounding as the full implications of American naval defeat at Hormuz propagate through every market and every reserve portfolio built on assumptions that no longer hold. For the world watching these events, the lesson of the Strait of Hormuz is the most important strategic lesson of the 21st century, stated in the most definitive operational terms available. No form of military supremacy is self-sustaining. Every advantage creates the adversarial incentive to develop the capability that defeats it. The Fattah-4 that destroyed 5 American carriers was not a strategic surprise in the sense of being unforeseeable. It was the product of a development program whose trajectory was visible and whose implications were accessible by any analyst willing to engage with the evidence honestly. The failure was not of intelligence. It was of institutional honesty. And that failure has produced consequences measured in 5 carriers on the floor of the Persian Gulf and 25,000 American sailors in the waters above them. Defense Insight Brief will be here for every development that follows. We will analyze the reconstruction of American naval strategy against the operational baseline that tonight has permanently established. We will track the global financial transition, accelerating from the petrodollar's defeat at Hormuz. We will examine the multipolar order taking institutional form in the strategic vacuum that American naval retreat has created. Share this video with everyone trying to understand what happened at the Strait of Hormuz at 1:24 a.m. Subscribe to Defense Insight Brief. Stay locked in. This is Defense Insight Brief. We will see you when the next chapter breaks.